Sliding Frasiers is a rare episode of Frasier where I genuinely do not care for it, but I don't think it's a bad episode. And I will explain what I mean by that in a moment. This is the 13th episode of Season 8 of Frasier. It's directed by Pamela Fryman. And as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through things chronologically and share some thoughts. And I don't like it because I do not care for the narrative structure. I really don't care for it at all. That's not unique to this episode. There are many shows and films that take a similar approach, and generally I don't care. But I also think they did a really good job with it because we have two parallel timelines, and I will obviously expand on that, and I think they did a really great job of making it very easy to follow. Initially through Frasier's clothing, and then something that happens that we'll get into a little bit later on. So if this is the way they wanted to tell the story, I think they did a really good job with it. But because it doesn't work well for me, I didn't really care for it. But the final scene, the final scene over the credits, made me laugh quite a lot, but of course we'll talk about that when we get there. Starts off in Cafe Nervosa with Roz and Frasier. Frasier says he's going speed dating, and then Niles comes in wearing a t-shirt with a photo of him and Daphne. And then Frasier is trying to decide whether he will wear a sweater or a suit for his speed dating, and he says, and I quote, "The tiniest decision can shape your whole destiny." And that's the theme of the whole episode. He picks the suit. We then meet a character called Mike, played by Jon Curry, who's just started at KCL. And then Frasier, as he's about to leave Cafe Nervosa, is knocked down. So Monica, who kind of caused this, takes him to ER. Monica is played by Charlotte Ross. And that's the story where he picked the suit. We then jump back in time a minute, and then we see Frasier actually picking the sweater. This time he isn't knocked down, and Mike actually meets Monica, and Frasier is able to leave and go off on his speed dating. So we have two timelines, one where he goes for the dates, one where he ends up going off with Monica. We're then at the ER with Frasier and Monica, and then we see a bad speed date, and then Frasier returns home, and obviously because he's wearing the sweater, it's easy to determine which timeline we're in. I thought that was a really solid decision. There was never really any point where I felt confused. Maybe it took me a second to kind of confirm with myself, oh yes, this is the timeline where this happened. But because it's a very clear, obvious choice, it makes it generally pretty easy to keep up with the back and forth. Daphne comes in. Niles then phones Martin to ask him to pack a suitcase for Daphne for a surprise Cancun trip. Personally, I hate the idea of somebody packing a suitcase for me, but we do address this a little later on. Frasier is then moping by the piano because his speed dating didn't go well. We then jump to the alternate timeline. Frasier is returning home from the hospital, and I'll be honest, up until this point I'm finding it really boring. Just the actual events, there wasn't really anything that made me laugh, so it's being very well handled. I'm just not enjoying it. Then Daphne comes in, and then Niles phones, and thankfully they didn't repeat the entire conversation Martin had. Instead, it focuses on Frasier arranging another date with Monica. We then cut to Cafe Nervosa with Frasier. He's actually in a sling, an arm sling now, because obviously he hurt himself when he fell down, so obviously he's not going to be wearing the suit the following day, but it helps us to keep up with the timelines. Now it's arm sling or no arm sling, which again I thought was a really solid decision. And Monica then comes into Cafe Nervosa, and then we cut to Frasier without the sling, moping in the apartment. Niles eats sauce from Daphne's nose, then tells Daphne about the trip, and Daphne is very happy that Martin has already packed a bag for her, which would not be my response, but again, we'll come back to that again later. Roz then phones to see if Frasier wants to go to the benefit, and meanwhile, Daphne and Niles are Lady and the Tramping some spaghetti, and honestly, I'm just bored. Nothing interesting has happened at all. And I do think the final scene is the only thing that I genuinely enjoyed. And interestingly, the penultimate scene, I think kind of overrides the entire message of the whole episode. And maybe that's the point, and I'll talk about that in more detail when we get there. But I don't enjoy this. So again, it's well crafted. It goes back and forth at a rate that's not too jarring, but for me, nothing interesting has happened at all. We then cut to Frasier with the sling, explaining all the things he's done for Monica, all of these wonderful romantic things, and then Niles has an allergic reaction, because in this timeline, Daphne never learned of an allergy that Niles has, whereas in the alternate timeline, she does find out, and in this timeline as well, because Daphne's getting flustered, Niles is having an allergic reaction, and then she expresses irritation that Martin packed a bag for her. And that's what I agree with. So that one's kind of interesting because it's kind of saying that when she was in a good mood with the surprise, she was okay about the bag being packed, but because she's all flustered with the allergic reaction, she's now not happy with it, and maybe it says that our responses to a situation differ depending on how panicked we are, which does make a lot of sense. But certainly the whole not finding out about an allergy was quite interesting. That's really the only major thing that changed in other people's timelines revolving around Frasier. We then cut to the benefit. Frasier with the sling is there with Monica, and then almost immediately we cut to Frasier no sling arriving at the benefit, and then we cut back to Frasier at the benefit dancing with Monica. It's clear to us as the viewer that it's all a little bit too much for Monica, but Frasier then gets up and starts singing to her, and actually I thought it was really lovely. I think I'd honestly enjoy it. Maybe if I'd only just met Frasier I wouldn't, but I found that he had a really nice voice, as Kelsey Grammer does, and I thought it was nice. But she's clearly uncomfortable. They separate amicably, and then Monica bumps into Mike. So maybe that was fate after all, they were meant to meet. And then Frasier is in his car on the way home from the benefit. Both versions of Frasier, we cut back and forth. They're both listening to the radio. And there is an interesting moment where both cars, well, one car is stopped at the lights and the other car drives up behind the car and drives on top of it. The ghost of the other car merges with the other car. So the two Frasiers merge together, and they're both listening to the radio, and it's one of Frasier's shows where somebody had phoned in and said, if you're ever in this area, come and meet me, and Frasier decides in that moment that he will. And both Frasiers, now merged as one car, turn around and drive off. And this is a bit of a confusing message because it contradicts what Frasier said at the beginning, but at the same time, it plays into fate. So it depends on what you're looking to get out of this, because at the beginning, Frasier said, and I quote again, the tiniest decision can shape your whole destiny. Which, yes, I think is true. But also, Frasier made two decisions. His entire journey was different, but the destiny was the same. He ultimately ended up, presumably, we can assume he went off for a date with the woman who had spoken with him. So actually, those tiny decisions didn't shape his destiny. It shaped the journey, but the destiny was the same. So there we have kind of two contradictory statements, but I think depending on what you believe in, it could be interesting, because on the one hand, tiny decisions can make a significant difference, but also if something is fate, if something is your destiny, then the journey there might be different depending on your decisions, but the final outcome will be the same, because that is your destiny. You choose how you get there, but the end result will always be the same. And that's kind of my belief. I believe we all have destinies, things to achieve, things to do in life. How we get there is down to our free will, but the final outcome will always be the same. That is it. That is in line with my belief, but it's not what the episode itself seemed to suggest for the entire thing. So it throws a bit of a surprise there at the end, and I'm not sure if that was their intention or if it's a bit of an oversight. I'd like to imagine the former, but it very well could be the latter. I don't know. So it was a nice moment. Visually, it looked pretty good. But at the same time, it kind of says that actually the tiniest decisions won't alter your destiny. They might just alter your journey. But again, that comes down to personal belief. And then we have the final scene over the credits with Martin and Eddie sitting in the chair. Martin's flicking through the television, but then it keeps cutting to a different time later, obviously the alternate timelines, but Martin's doing the exact same thing in each one, and I loved that a lot. I thought it was very, very funny. Really thoroughly enjoyed it, and as I said, for me that was my highlight. I guess the penultimate scene with Frasier in the car, that was the most thought-provoking aspect, because it did make me think, well, yes, your tiny decisions can change your destiny, but also this shows that the destination is going to be the same. So I think it would be more accurate for Frasier to have said at the beginning, the tiniest decision can shape your whole journey, not destiny. But again, it comes down to whether or not you believe in destiny, but ultimately, as we see with Frasier, it did shape his journey, but not the destiny. Either way, I don't care for it, but there's nothing wrong with it. I think they did a really good job of telling the story or stories in this way. In fact, I think they did a really good job with it, of making it easy to keep up with what was happening. The pacing was really good, very well edited, no problems at all. But for me, Sliding Frasiers is never going to be one that I love.